Okay, ladies, this screencast is going to cover the rest of the notes on the American home front during World War II. So make sure you have your chapter 24 outline open and find the place where we're going to begin. We did discuss about Japanese internment, which is kind of overlapping with all this, and now we're going to just discuss the rest of the things. So first off, a general overview. Let's see if this is working. There we go. Okay. So just some general information about how this is going to affect the economy. Obviously, one of the reasons the U.S. wanted to remain isolated from World War II was the Great Depression, which was very negatively impacting the U.S. economy. But it's actually going to be World War II and our involvement in the war that brings the U.S. out of that economic depression. And it's not really the New Deal that does it, it's World War II. So military spending will give our economy the boost it needed. It will create lots of jobs, especially jobs that involve producing items of war, which we'll talk about. We kind of have to transition our economy to prepare for our ability to fight in this war. But in that transition, we create lots of jobs, which is answering the big problem of the Great Depression, unemployment. Another aspect of general information as it applies to the war is the demand for labor is going to kind of shift. We're going to see, obviously, a lot of men leaving the labor force to go and fight in the war itself, which leaves kind of a void of labor and war labor jobs. And so women and minorities will fill that void, and they will have some access to, the highest paying jobs they've ever had access to. Do the job the man left behind. So that goes for both women and minorities collectively, and we'll discuss that. So the government's going to take several steps to help convert the U.S. economy to a military economy. And part of that kind of transition or conversion is creating the War Production Board. The War Production Board is going to encourage civilian industries to convert to military industries. We need weapons. We need military aircrafts. We need tires for military vehicles. We need more military vehicles created. And so, companies that were making maybe just regular ships are now going to transition to making, warships and naval ships. Same with planes. And same with war vehicles. Jeep is a major manufacturer of wartime vehicles, tanks as well. So the government would kind of incentivize civilian companies to transition their production. We're also going to see kind of some on the rise companies taking advantage of this wartime economy. One of these examples is actually Coca-Cola. So if you are a soda lover, you'll find this story interesting. The head of Coca-Cola products at the time, his name was Robert Woodruff. You don't need to know his name, but he's going to convince the American Army that Coke was an essential drink, well suited for sailors and soldiers, helping them to stay alert on the battlefield and during, times of combat, times of war. And so Coca-Cola plants are going to be built overseas to produce the Coke products and provide them to soldiers. But for those who are soda drinkers, you know that soda, Coke is addictive because of that caffeine ingredient. People who try to go, days or weeks without it, who are used to drinking it, are said to potentially develop withdrawal effects in the forms of headaches. So my point here is this is a smart business move by Woodruff because he's creating a huge customer base. When the soldiers come home from war, this is the drink they'll demand at dinner time, because they're so used to drinking it overseas. This is where that high demand of Coke products kind of comes from. Another example of a company kind of taking advantage of the wartime economy was Lucky Strike cigarettes. The package, as you see on the screen, was typically in a green color. But because that color dye was being rationed and kind of limited during the war, they shifted it to red to be more patriotic. And so it was sold as kind of like a patriotic cigarette or a patriotic smoke, which upped its business. If you are familiar with the show Mad Men, that's a very popular cigarette brand in this kind of post-war era, but its demand kind of came from this. Another kind of effect on the home front is that women are going to begin to plant victory gardens. These are home, grown gardens to help with the high demand of produce. If you were able to grow your local, produce out of a victory garden in your backyard, or even in like a subdivision or neighborhood in a community, then that's going to help for more goods to be sold overseas or brought overseas. It creates like a higher supply or a surplus left over in the grocery store. Another big effect on the home front is rationing. So some items in war are in super high demand. Some of this is like food, such as sugar or meats, coffee. But another high in demand item is gas, oil. And there's several other things that are being rationed as well. But your high in demand items are rationed, meaning, citizens at home, households are limited in terms of how much they are able to purchase and consume of this certain item. So the picture you see on the screen is like little tickets. Basically, a family, based on how many were in your house, would get a booklet of kind of stamps or tickets at the beginning of the month, and the ticket represented the amount of something you were allotted or allowed to buy, whether it be sugar or meat or, like I said, gas, filling up your tank. And so whenever you went to purchase this item, you had to present a ticket with it at the grocery store or at the gas station. And if you didn't have a ticket, you couldn't get it. So that's how they were able to regulate how much of something someone would purchase, because you had to, the owner of the store, the business, had to collect the ticket when they sold that item. Propaganda is a huge part of the World War II era. One of my favorite rooms in the World War II Museum in New Orleans is the room of propaganda posters of all kinds, kind of trying to basically, persuade American citizens to, favor our efforts in the war one way or the other. So you saw basically the government trying to encourage support for the war effort in a variety of ways, whether it was, enlisting, planting gardens, rationing, purchasing, war bonds, producing and taking on a labor job. And it was typically, posters, but you also had like pamphlets handed out and cartoons as well. But these are just some of my favorite propaganda posters. This one depicts Hitler's ghost riding a shotgun alongside you if you were to ride without a co-pilot, meaning like you're not conserving gas because you're not carpooling. So it says when you ride alone, you ride with Hitler. Join a car sharing club today. This is trying to promote the conservation of certain scrap materials that are high in demand, and you see if the little leftover pieces of like office supplies form Hitler's face. This one shows that they go through great lengths to kind of tug at your emotions with these posters. So in this picture, you see the swastika shadow kind of overhanging over the young American children. Don't let that shadow touch them. Buy war bonds. Almost trying to emphasize that if you were to not buy war bonds, you're putting your family and these kids at risk. And so they're willing to go through great lengths really to sway Americans into doing one thing or another for the war effort. So we're going to talk about how African Americans are affected in World War II, and mainly in labor and wartime jobs, including the military. One thing that kind of happens right off the bat is that Franklin Roosevelt creates the FEPC, which stands for the Fair Employment Practices Commission. This basically said there could not be any discrimination in the defense industry, any kind of factory with a government contract that is producing wartime goods. Those industries were not allowed legally to discriminate who they hire based on race. The reality is the government can't afford for any company to discriminate on race when it comes to hiring, because there is such a void and such a high demand within the labor force. And so this organization is kind of a big forefront with that. It says, you basically couldn't deny based on race, creed, religion, other things. So you did have, as you see in the picture, kind of unity in terms of African Americans working in labor jobs, but you also have African Americans who are serving in the military, whether they enlist by choice or they are drafted. They do serve in segregated units. Unfortunately, the FEPC did not include the military, and the U.S. military and all its branches would remain segregated until after World War II. But African Americans who were fighting for America in World War II were said to be fighting, for a double V victory. They wanted to, they see parallels in like how Adolf Hitler treats his citizens and how the U.S. is not fully acting, democratically and giving African Americans all their rights at home or honoring those rights. And so they wanted to go overseas, fight for the U.S., serve their nation, defeat Nazism, but then to come home and continue that fight in defeating, racism and racial oppression at home. And so it's no coincidence the civil rights movement is kind of rooted in the years after World War II, because that's kind of the same time period it's taking place. This is just a political cartoon to display the FEPC's, movement of incorporating African American labor. So another Dr. Seuss commercial where Uncle Sam tells war industry, listen, maestro, if you want to get real harmony, use the black keys as well as the white ones. Kind of a musical joke, but you definitely get it if you play the piano and know that you have to kind of incorporate all the keys to make some good music. Definitely want to talk about women in this war. Women definitely serve in the labor force, but before we get there, I want to talk about women in the military, because this is the first war where women are actively enlisting and serving in the U.S. military branches. You kind of see some of these acronyms on this slide, but women served in the Army as part of the WAC, which stood for Women's Army Corps. They served in the Navy as part of the WAVES, which was a mouthful. Women accepted for volunteer emergency services. And then they served as WASPs in the Air Force, which stood, WASP stands for Women's Air Force Service Pilots. So before, women maybe were just nurses, like in, serving abroad or volunteering their time, but now they're actively enlisting. So you see some of these posters and images. They're not serving in active combat, of course, but they are serving. Okay, women will predominantly, though, answer the call in terms of the need for a labor force. Women are going to fill the void in high volume in terms of taking a wartime job. The government uses propaganda, Rosie the Riveter, to encourage women who are typically housewives at accepting a wartime job. They don't make as much money as men when serving, but they do answer the call. They are expected to simultaneously maintain, their home responsibilities, their household duties with their job, but we're going to see some statistics on how this affects women in the workforce. It's a very uplifting time, and we'll see the aftermath of that in the next unit as well. Some other posters showing women in the workforce. I'm going to come back to this slide, and so maybe just I won't come back to it. Maybe just pause the screencast now and jot down the notes if you want. These are just some statistics of how women answering the call in the labor force is affected, numbers-wise, how many more women go to work than ever before. Okay, so if you want to pause the screencast and just write that down. You won't have to reiterate these numbers. It's just kind of telling. Oh, and if you've seen A League of Their Own, women also volunteered for entertainment in the form of a National Women's Baseball League. Great movie, by the way. You should go check it out. Okay, the last thing I wanted to say really quickly as this screencast kind of wraps up is that Native Americans also had a role in this in terms of minority involvement, because the Navajo language will be used as the military code for the U.S. in World War II. This is super intelligent because, all of the Native American languages are pretty much indigenous and localized to North America, so it would be very hard for any parts of Asia or Europe to translate or break these codes. And we learned this already because I think Choctaw was actually used in World War I, but the Navajo group that volunteer for translation are called the Code Talkers.